Thank you, Stefan. Good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Thomas. I am the director of the European Journalism Centre. And our job is to build resilience into European media, and we do that by connecting journalists to new ideas, to new skills, to new people, and to new funding. And look, here's a big number for you. There are 146,000 private public benefit foundations in Europe, and they spend 51 billion euros annually on their giving and on their programs. Only a tiny fraction of that actually goes to media organizations and journalists, and yet almost all of those public benefit organizations rely in some way on media and journalism to achieve their mission. And it was against the backdrop of this big, somewhat wicked problem that the European Journalism Centre and 7 foundations decided to set up a community called the Journalism Funders Forum. And we have 2 goals with this forum. The first is to connect journalists and foundations to help them understand more about each other's work and hopefully build more impactful and purposeful relationships. And then the second is to basically increase the overall pot of money, primarily by encouraging new organizations, new foundations who've never previously worked in the journalism space to come in and start funding in this area. And one of the mechanisms by which we do that is panels like this, where we ask people who have a lot of experience in funding journalism to basically open up and to get kind of confidential about some of the ways in which they work, how they choose grantees, what makes a good proposal. And this is really important because there's an inherent power dynamic between funders, people who give money and people who take money, and we try and make these sessions as much of a leveler as possible. So I'm going to be opening up, I hope, at least 50% of this session to questions from you all. But I will start off by asking some people to make some introductions. So why don't we start with you, Miguel, if that's okay. Perhaps you can just tell us who you are, who you work for, and how journalism fits into the overall mission of your organization.
All right. Hi everyone. My name is Miguel Castro. I'm with a team called Global Media Partnerships within the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation. This is a 8-year-old portfolio where we do manage long-term relationships with media organizations, mostly through grant making. And we do this because we want to, we find ourselves in the need of incentivized coverage on issues that we care about quite a lot, around global health, eradication of diseases, etc., or global development, extreme poverty, and how to eradicate that as well. Or lately, as in the last couple of years, a very strong commitment to gender equality with a development angle. So there is an obvious and tremendous market failure of media to cover these issues, even when it's incentivized, it's still a relatively small part of the output and content that people consume. So, and when some of the areas of the work that we care a lot about, like Africa or Southeast Asia, etc., are covered in media, normally they're reflected on the basis of issues like conflict, politics, elections, humanitarian crisis, etc., etc. So, in a way, not being the core strategy, everything that we do hopes to change and impact positively that narrative because it doesn't reflect the reality anymore. And there's 2 or 3 things about the way we work with media organizations that I think are important. One is that we do know very well about the audiences that we care about. We invest a lot of time, energy, and research on figuring out what are the people and the groups of people that we think that need to consume this content that we believe is so important for societies. So that in a sense frames the type of organizations that we work with is a little bit of a filter. So we don't normally address the general public. It is not in our mandate. It's a little bit of a big task. So we have quite clear narratives and strategies about the topics that we believe are most neglected And we look for, or we engage with media organizations that agree with us, or that on the basis of conversations to develop these projects come together to an understanding about how those narratives need to be informed. And the second one is that we value tremendously trust. And by that I mean the trust that particular audiences have on the media that we work with. There are media organizations that know very well the levels of trust and the relationship that they have with their audiences. There are others that not so much. But regardless of the state of that insight ability within media organizations, we look for that information, and when we don't have it, we ask questions and commission it, because we believe that when media organizations engage with audiences, the ability to make this content able to inform and engage those audiences is directly related to the level of trust that those audiences have in the content. And the other principle in which we operate currently is that we commit to the long term. So all our grants are 3 years or longer. So the narratives and the topics and the themes are complex, and sometimes media organizations require a period of adaptation in terms of the ambition of the project, or in terms of the complexity of the topics. And despite the fact that we don't work with organizations that haven't cared or reported about these issues before, to a certain extent, there is always a level of ambition that requires a transition from the day-to-day news journalism to a long form that changes narratives through multimedia, and fundamentally through consistency. So for us, it's all about, and with most media organizations that we work with, it's pretty clear now that in order to affect narratives, you have to report on these issues consistently and over time, and coming from different angles, and addressing all of the nuances, because the reporting generally is complex, but in some of the issues that we care about and we invest our funding is a little bit more complex because of the nature of it, how far it is, how very little reporting on the ground is done in places like Africa or South Asia or China as well. And although we've done in the past entertainment, documentary, and other forms, we now pretty much around 70 to 80% of our funding goes to journalism, to news hubs, to authoritative news outlets that have those levels of trust with media audiences that I was talking about before. Yeah, that's a bit of a summary.
Great, that's super insightful already, I think. Stephanie, you're with a foundation that is very different, of course, different in scale, but also a little in scope in terms of the background. Tell us about it.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Stefanie Reuter. I'm the managing director of the German Rudolf Augstein Foundation. And I have to say it's a real privilege to be on stage with the Gates Foundation, Luminate, and OSF, because as you already mentioned, we are kind of a different foundation. And I think it's important to stress that the foundation sector in Europe, but also globally, is a very diverse sector. So that means you have smaller foundations, medium-sized foundations as we are, and of course the big global players. So what I find interesting is that we are really operating in an ecosystem and trying to connect with each other and trying to play different roles in that ecosystem. So what we do at the Rudolf Augstein Foundation, we are a foundation based in Germany, as I said, so we have we are mostly focusing on the German-speaking world, but we also have some projects that we fund with a European scope. We are a grant-making foundation. We have an endowment of 40 million euros, so we are kind of small in comparison to the Gates Foundation, who has an endowment of 40 billion euros, or dollars, sorry, don't get me wrong. Our goal is to strengthen critical journalism and freedom of the press, and I'd like to say that we have journalism in our DNA because our founder was Rudolf Augstein. He was a journalist himself. He was the founder of Der Spiegel, which is one of the most prominent investigative news magazines in Germany. And due to our limited resources, we try to identify projects that can have leverage effects. So what does that mean? We look out for projects that try to strengthen the journalistic infrastructure, that make use or smart use of network technologies or strengthen journalism as such. So that means that we do not fund or we do not give away research grants, we do not fund content, and we have a specific focus on investigative journalism, also cross-border journalism, innovation, of course, because we all know we have to find new ways, we have to define journalism differently if we really want to strengthen its role in society nowadays, if we like to reach the communities we want to serve. And we also support talent, and we think it's really important to strengthen diversity newsrooms. So those are our main funding areas, and we can go into more detail later, I think.
Perfect, thank you. Nishant, well, I mean, I'll let you explain yourself, but you're sort of in a way the newbie of the group in terms of Luminate is the newest organization here, but obviously coming out of an organization with a long tradition in supporting media. How does this new organization shape up, and what are you thinking about that's maybe different from the last 12 months, let's say?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So we used to be part of a media network. Last time I was speaking here a year ago, we were the Global Governance and Citizen Engagement team at a media network, and we spun out in October to become Luminate. We actually largely have the same team and the same strategy, and that strategy is published on our website, so you can have a look at the areas in which we fund there, but I'll talk about them a little bit today. So Luminate essentially tries to build stronger societies in the 18 countries in which we work. That includes the US, 5 in Latin America, 4 in Africa, a number in Asia, and also parts of Europe, France, Germany, and UK, Poland, Georgia, and Ukraine as well. And we do this essentially by investing in strong governance, robust information ecosystems, and also civic empowerment. And a very important part of our strategy is investing in independent media, which is why I'm here today. I am the director of independent media at Luminate, and we essentially look at 4 different areas to invest and support media ecosystems. The first is collaborative, non-profit, investigative journalism. And so we fund, for example, ICIJ, OCCRP, I'm sure most of you know those organizations, as well as Amabugane in South Africa, who did the Gupta Leaks work recently. The second area is looking for financial models for editorial independence. And so there we're looking for kind of innovative models. We're investing a lot in membership, Correspondent, the Membership Puzzle Project, the Ken in India, Nexo in Brazil, and so on. And some of those models are doing very well. The Ken, for example, in India is profitable through a membership model that has a very tight relationship with its members. The third area is around press freedom. And there we invest in organizations that support press freedom, such as Reporters Without Borders or Forbidden Stories. And then the fourth area is kind of fighting mis and disinformation, which is an area where we're actively looking for solutions. That's a complex and dynamic problem set, and we do fund some fact-checking work, we fund some algorithmic work to filter out mis and disinformation. But I would love ideas that the audience has on how we can do better in that area.
Great, thank you, Nishant. Sue, you work on the opening journalism team at Open Society Foundations. How does that fit into the wider remit of what OSF does?
Right. Good morning. Good morning. Yes, Open Society Foundations can be quite a complex organization to explain to people. The funds come from George Soros, but it's explicitly called the Open Society Foundations. It doesn't follow his whims, and it's not all about him. It's about the philosophy of keeping societies open and democratic. But we have both national foundations, regional foundations, and then what we call thematic programs, which could be on justice, human rights, migration, education. And the journalism program is one of those thematic programs working globally, but often in concert and in conjunction with our regional foundations, who might also be supporting media in that region. And so we do not, the program on independent journalism, as it's called, it does not work in North America, to a very limited extent in Western Europe, but otherwise everywhere else that we can. Within the program on independent journalism, we have three main portfolios. Investigative journalism, which I was listening to Nishant, there's quite a lot of overlaps between what Luminate is now doing and what we've been doing. So the investigative journalism, it supports networks of investigative journalists, it supports some tools and technologies for exposing and dissecting disinformation and fostering collaborations around investigative journalism stories. We have a portfolio which we call Free and Safe. It's around freedom of expression, safety of journalists, also supporting some of the larger press freedom groups around the world, but also regional groups and even some in-country groups, keeping journalists safe, journalists who have to flee their countries, but to try and make sure that they can continue to work in journalism and not land up as a taxi driver somewhere. And so looking for ways to keep journalists working as journalists, but in a safer country. So that's that. And then we have a small portfolio called knowledge sharing. We believe that journalists really learn well from other journalists rather than training sometimes. So peer learning as much as possible, sharing information. There are fantastic journals and so on in the north that come from Neiman Labs, Columbia Journalism Review, Pointer, etc. There's not much at all coming from the south, from the east. So we do some support to try and bolster knowledge sharing from other places. And then the opening journalism portfolio, which I coordinate, looks at startups. We support startups. We support some degree of experimentation and innovation, take the risk with somebody who wants to try something different, and then existing digital organizations that are looking to solve any one of the problems that digital journalism confronts these days, from thinking about revenue models to better engagement with audiences, different ways of storytelling, and so on. So in a big nutshell, that's what we do.
Perfect, thank you. Well, that's super useful. And Stephanie, you talked about the diversity in the foundation scene, and you're so right. It's such an important point, and it's been one of the challenges that we've had with the Journalism Funders Forum is that when we brought people together, amongst the foundations, there's such a diversity of how they think, how they approach funders. I think one of the things that's most interesting for me, but also most confusing sometimes for journalists, is the number of different approaches you will take to finding grantees, but also soliciting proposals or deciding who you sort of work with. And I know there's a number of different approaches on the panel, so maybe I just throw it open here to anyone who wants to jump in. You've all spent a lot of time thinking about how you do this, whether you have a closed call or an open call, all of these types of things. What have you decided is the best way, or is it a mix? And sort of how did you reach that conclusion? And I throw that open if anyone wants to jump in.
I can start by saying that we don't do calls. Mm-hmm. It takes for us to develop a relationship, and that's how we want it, and normally that's how our media partners want it a long time. The longest 3 years, the shortest 6 months. And it's only when both the partner and the donor agree on that Venn diagram, that part where mm-hmm. what I want out of this relationship and what they want out of this relationship. And all of the conditions within that, which is a long list, and it will take for an entire hour. But it's about that, finding that moment in which, okay, this is something that we both care about truly. This is something that we think that we can have an impact. This is a place where our journalism can do good. So, and I wouldn't know how to replicate that on an open call. However, it is also true that there are periods in which I look back at the portfolio and I see we're doing a lot of the same, just different geographies and different outlets and sizes and approaches, but there is a little bit of the same in the portfolio, and that moment is when you feel, how can I? So what you do is you come to Perugia, you go to Jan, you put yourself out there and talk to a lot of people to see if you can collect those ideas. But the calls, I haven't found that mechanism useful so far yet.
I can speak to that. I really agree with Miguel in terms of the trying relationship that you're trying to build with prospective grantees. We also don't do open calls, but what we've noticed, and what I've noticed in my prior experience at the Global Innovation Fund, for example, where we did run an open call for proposals, is that a narrow problem statement around what the call is about really, really helps the right level of applications and the right, allowing the funder to respond appropriately. And so for us to hold, let's say, an open call on media in 18 countries would probably be quite counterproductive. But we do open calls with grantees or kind of programs that we run. So some examples are the South Africa Media Innovation Program, which we co-fund with the Open Society Foundation in South Africa. And that's really about up-and-coming media organizations in South Africa that need early-stage support. That's probably the right kind of problem statement. Another example is the Membership Puzzle Project, which we've set up the Membership in News Fund with, and they put out a call for proposals for organizations interested in developing their membership programs in journalism. They have expertise in that area. Organizations that need that expertise then can match them. And so I feel like articulating exactly what the problem statement is for open calls is critical.
Stephanie?
Maybe I can add something, because we all know, like in the foundation scene, that it's really hard sometimes for people to approach us due to the fact that we know there's that kind of power imbalance. So I think it's really important, especially as we do, if you give seed funding, that you're really approachable. So, and it also differs with your strategy, of course, as Miguel and Nishant just mentioned, because if you give away like big funding and you really work together for a long time, and we also support core funding, long-term funding, but before we can do that, we have to know the persons who are involved, the organizations, and we have to know them pretty well, because it's really also a trust business, and we'll come to that point later, I guess. But what I think is really important, as you said, if you operate with open calls, be very specific and focused, and think about what you'd like to achieve beforehand, because otherwise it really doesn't make sense. But then on the other hand, we have to make sure that it's possible that people with really new ideas, and pretty often people come to us and kind of complain, and they say, well, we do not fit in that program or that specific call, so it's really different for us. And I kind of find it really interesting, because we are really interested in cross-disciplinary approaches and projects. So how can we make sure as foundation officers, managers, that we provide the funding like the ecosystem needs? And it's kind of tricky, but as I said, and it's really about try to build that relationship, and it's really something that has to evolve over time. So if you have the chance at a conference, for example, to approach someone for the first time, do it and use that chance, and then keep up the conversation, because it's really about, we'd like to learn from the field. We are really interested in a lot of different projects, and pretty often we are also there to get ideas, to think about things, and then it's also pretty often about collaboration and thinking about, okay, how does that fit in my portfolio? So, yeah.
I'd echo what's been said, but we don't generally do open calls, but we did do one 2 years ago. And learned a great deal, as much about ourselves as about the process. And the reason that we did it was because we generally do the same thing, meeting people at these sorts of conferences. People approach us. We take things on a one-by-one basis as people reach out to us. But there are lots of smaller newsrooms, people who don't know the donor network, who don't know how these systems work. And so we thought, let's put out an open call, went out globally, distinguished investigative journalism, some of the criteria in the opening journalism field, and some of the free and safe. And we had about, in the space of 3.5, 4 weeks, about 600, 700 things come flooding in, which our team had to start to sift through. But at the end of that, there were a couple of organizations that we then began relationships with that we would otherwise never necessarily have found through our through the usual networks. There were others who'd come in and seen this as an opportunity to at least get on our radar. So I think I totally agree with Nishant. The narrower the question, what you're trying to achieve, I think an open call can work for that. I don't think it's the kind of thing, we don't plan on doing this again in a hurry. But it was just to throw the thing open and see what we're missing and give people an opportunity to get in front of us in a very small way. Otherwise, generally, it's also a lot of traveling on our parts and visiting countries, linking up with local, our national foundations, or just going in to connect with journalists in a country and one person leads to another, and really trying to understand the landscape in that place and meet journalists who are journalists at work and not necessarily part of some sort of development agenda or program.
You probably noticed that I haven't plugged the European Journalism Center Challenge Fund yet. But so we do, both in Africa and Europe, have been incredibly lucky to find two organizations that host a fairly sizable innovation challenges where media organizations or freelancers apply to do series or special reports, and in Europe it's run by the European Journalism Center. It's called Innovation in Development Reporting. Yeah. Sorry, I had to do it.
No, it's good, it's good. I usually do the full transparency thing at the beginning about who funded us, but one thing I get my ass kicked about a lot around that fund, for instance, is the geographical focus of that, Miguel, that we focus on certain countries rather than others at certain times. And I think most of you, obviously, Stephanie, you have a particular focus on Germany, but I think the other three, I'm interested in, and I think journalists are sometimes confused by why you pick certain countries over others, firstly. And then secondly, there sometimes seems to be parallel tracks of work from foundations, and they're not super aware of each other's work. You actually mentioned a collaborative project in South Africa. So maybe we just go to South Africa, for instance, as a concrete example of why your organizations decided to work there in particular, and then how the two of you also, or your two organizations, let's say, decided and managed to make that collaboration happen.
I'm happy to start.
Go right ahead.
As I mentioned earlier, Luminate focus on a number of areas in order to kind of improve the democratic ecosystems in which we work. Those four areas are independent media, civic empowerment, so we fund platforms for institutions to have better relationships with individuals and vice versa, things like change.org. The third area is financial transparency, sort of anti-corruption initiatives, and the fourth area is data and digital rights, which is an increasingly important part of any governance ecosystem. What we do when we choose which countries to work in is we try and ensure that all four of those elements can be active and working in concert to ensure that we actually make progress. It's really hard to make progress in terms of governance ecosystems and democratic ecosystems. As Maria Ressa was saying yesterday, just publishing stories and allowing them to flow out into the world doesn't always have the impact that you want. Sometimes it can, but rarely. You need communities of action alongside that in order to kind of create dynamic movements that inspire change. So, for example, in South Africa, all four of those areas that I mentioned are working in concert, and that really came to life with the fall of the Zuptas, you know, the Gupta leaks. Yes, but the Zuma and the Guptas. Yeah, thanks for allowing me to explain that. And there, what happened is our kind of financial transparency grantees, who were kind of pushing for greater information on the links between the Zuma presidency and various financial interests in the Guptas and otherwise, worked alongside investigative journalism organizations like Amubagane, worked alongside civic empowerment organizations that created essentially a movement and spread the information around, using WhatsApp and other channels to help people understand what to do about it. And that eventually resulted in the fall of a very corrupt regime. And so there are certain areas certain countries in which it's very, very hard to work on sort of institutional reform. So certain countries in the Middle East, in Russia, in China, even if in some of those countries you might be able to have certain independent media voices. And that's ultimately what helps us decide which countries to work in.
I'm South African, so that's part of the... But I'm not at the South African Foundation. I once directed their media program, but the partnership is between the Open Society Foundation for South Africa and Luminate, and then so in terms of selection, I think that our program, the Independent Journalism Program, doesn't fund topic-led investigations or journalism. We believe in supporting organizations to be strong enough to be able to have the appropriate staff and to choose what areas if they're decent journalists, they know what the issues are in their society, and we respect that and hope that they will do the job to the best of their ability, and then hopefully activists and so on might pick up on those issues and take them forward. Hopefully there's, laws get revised, commissions get instated, people go to jail perhaps. But we don't fund anything that's topic-led. We believe that should be chosen by the journalists themselves. We also would, in terms of the world, where would we work? I said earlier we don't work in North America and to a very limited extent in Western Europe. That's because Open Society has a big American program, but also there are a lot of funders working in those areas, and so rightly or wrongly, our focus tends to go elsewhere. And we would look at countries perhaps where there are moments of opportunity, of some sort of transition or something coalescing, and it's actually journalism has got an opportunity it should be strengthened in order to sustain itself, to be perhaps a beacon for other countries in the region, that there's a place where journalism is thriving and press freedom is being respected. And where there are people with really good ideas that are focused on their audience. And I think that's one of the key things for us in terms of who we might fund, is what need are you meeting, who are you going to serve, and where do you fit into a very noisy, loud information system. Do you know your audience, and what needs are you going to meet? And those would be probably amongst the key criteria that we would consider in the opening journalism portfolio. In the investigative journalism portfolio, it's supporting investigations to happen pretty much anywhere.
Miguel, how are the decisions made on your side about which geographies and regions are important to you? Yeah,
so you have to prioritize. So from 2009 to 2015, there were $1.2 billion invested in journalism in the US, only 80 million in Europe. So the average grant in Europe is $70,000, media grant in Europe is $70,000, and there's only 9 grants over $1 million.
And that, to be clear, is the total pot, right? That's not you, that's everything,
so
everybody.
Organizations invested in the social change, like all 4 in here and many in the room. The pot of money that we have to work with is very small. So how do you prioritize? So we do as a Bill Melinda Gates Foundation a number of priorities. So the foundation works on low-income countries because it tries to address extreme poverty. There you go, a way to filter already. So we work in Western Europe, and we have partners, several of them in the room, El País, The Guardian, Le Monde, and others, because these are the countries where, according to the OECD Development Assistance Committee, devote more funding for ODA, Overseas Development Aid. So we believe that those are the societies who make the greatest commitment to development, and where the need for audiences to be more informed, more engaged, to keep their governments accountable to not just the quantity but also the quality of those investments is fundamental. So in Europe we work, our priority countries are the largest donors: UK, France and Germany, Sweden, Netherlands and Spain. And again, the greatest needs and the greatest opportunity is what defines as well our strategies within large continents like Africa, for example, or the South Continent. We work in India, but most of our projects are devoted to the two states that are where the most larger numbers of poor people are in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar in the north. And there is a great opportunity with Nigeria because many reasons it's about to eradicate polio. There's great development happening, etc. So those are the way we prioritize on the basis of policy, advocacy, government relationships, political intelligence, communication needs, not just the needs of journalism. So journalism is part of the tool set when we make decisions about where we invest. Yeah,
super useful to know. Stephanie, you obviously geography-wise, you focus on Germany. Probably, I'm assuming that's because of just the scale of your organisation and the demographic you know. But then, how are you thinking about it after that? Are you thinking in terms of topics, or do you, like Sue, think that maybe topics that should be a thing for the journalist to decide rather than you?
Definitely, that's also our approach, because we do not want to be the agenda setters, or as I said, we try to strengthen the ecosystem. So we support journalism for journalism's sake, which means we are really interested, and we often fund intermediaries. So we often fund organizations like the Association of Investigative Journalists in Germany, for example, who have the capacity and skills to support like the whole scene with knowledge transfer and to organize conferences and make sure that collaborations are built, networks are strengthened. So our approach, as I said, is more structural. So we are not interested in specific topics. We are interested, of course, in specific areas of journalism. Our focus is definitely on public interest journalism, because we all know that we do see a market failure in that specific area, especially with investigative journalism, which is like super expensive. So you really have to think about how do you use your resources. What I always wanted to add is that we kind of share the same vision or mission with you with the EGC, because we also try to promote journalism funding in Germany and German-speaking countries, also in Switzerland and Austria, because we really think it's super important to show those other foundations why it's important, although that it's not like stated in your charter that you are supporting journalism, why it's important for all foundations in all countries to start supporting journalism now, due to the function it plays in a democracy. So that's also something we really kind of focus on, because we think it's important coming like with that media background we have, and try to give peer support, try to map the ecosystem, because we realized it's really super difficult for new players entering the field, because they tell us if they are not trained journalists themselves, we do not really know how to start. And then people approach us, like journalists or organizations, and they do not really know how you can fit in their portfolio, what you can bring them. And I mean, I would always encourage journalists and organizations to ask for funding from foundations who have a specific thematic focus if your organization also focuses in this area, or the same with geography. I mean, place-based foundations, community foundations are the best partners for local news outlets. I'm really convinced about that, and we really have to think about how can we leverage that. And there are examples, for example, in the United States with the Newsmatch initiative, where foundations like ours, although that we have a national focus, we can kind of encourage the whole sector to step up to the problems we are facing. So, yeah.
That's a great point. I think that place-based foundations idea, you know, there are a lot of those organizations, and news outlets don't often think about engaging with them, but also local government as well. Outside of the foundation space, you know, local governments often have schemes to support innovation that can support local news organizations to do something different. You mentioned something very important, and I want to give a shout out to the Media Impact Funders report that came out recently. It's an incredible mapping of the foundation space with data. There's a real problem around data in this space. We understand a lot about the US, and I suspect the number that Miguel quoted about the amount of funding in Europe is probably slightly larger, but it's just hidden because there's not enough data on it in Europe. So I think we need to do more work in that space, but Media Impact Funders and Gates help to support that report. That's a really important report that you should look at. Anecdotally, we're seeing a lot more foundations in Europe who have never worked in this space before coming to us saying, how do we get involved? And we've been producing reports and guides, and there's a great report produced by Samir Padania for the Ariadne network, which is if you are a foundation thinking to move into this space for the first time, you should definitely check out that report because it's incredibly useful. I promised to throw open this session to questions from the audience. We've got about 20 minutes left, so I would like to do that. I'd also like to say you can tweet me at DataTheism if you're on the stream, or if you're just a shy person in the room who doesn't like talking in public, please tweet me and I'll try and include your questions. Okay, loads of hands. Can I get a mic to the front, please? Great. So we'll. I'm gonna start here with this gentleman here because he's in my eye line, and then we'll move to you next, if that's okay.
Thanks. Keith Richberg, I know a couple of you up here. I'm from the University of Hong Kong Journalism and Media Studies Center, HKU. And before that, and I've been there for about 2 years, and just to let you know what that is first, because I was a Washington Post correspondent for about 34 years before going there. Our program, and just really 1 minute, I don't want to take too long, but just because it's relevant, our program is very international. Most of the instructors are like myself. I'm from the Washington Post, our business correspondent who teaches business correspondent at Wall Street Journal. We have somebody from CNN for 20 years. And our students are very international. About half come from mainland China, but the rest come from all over the world. We have some this year from Germany, Italy, Estonia, et cetera. And right now our graduates are working everywhere. We've got 2 at the New York Times in Beijing and Hong Kong, Reuters, AFP, the Bloomberg bureau chief is our grad. The reason I say that's important is because when I've tried to fundraise, people say, oh, you're this little Hong Kong school here, and you're in China. So the problem, and so I can't raise money locally because business people, the people who do philanthropy in Hong Kong, don't want to piss off China, basically, by supporting journalism. The medical school, the business school, they've got all the money in the world, but when I go to raise money, they say, oh, well, yeah, you know, journalism, we don't really need that. When I go to U.S. foundations, they kind of, there's a problem, and you all mentioned it, kind of, there's a geographic focus, number one. And so because we're in Hong Kong, a lot of them say, well, we only support U.S. institutions, and you're in Hong Kong. And also because I find personally there's also this kind of topic focus these days. Fake news, disinformation is the hot topic, and everybody wants to fund that. So I've got literally more money than I know what to do with that. Google is throwing money at me, Facebook, and I'm saying I don't need any more money on fake news. I need money for other things. And then finally, and you mentioned it as well, people want to move the needle in countries, and they say China's too tough. And I keep trying to explain to people, but we're Hong Kong, we're not China, and our students are international, they're not Chinese, and they're going to places like the New York Times. So I'm just wondering how you get around that and make people focus on, but basically don't focus on what you think is the sexy thing now, like data journalism and fake news, but find out what we're trying to do and work with us. So that's, so those are a lot of questions rolled into one, but I hope you kind of get the point there. Thanks.
Great. Does anyone on the panel want to respond to that directly?
So the Gates Foundation supports media in China, so it's perfectly possible. So we do it, others can, some others can't. But the question of it is true, and within the donor community we've talked about that. The misinformation and disinformation took by surprise absolutely everyone, as much journalists as donors. And there has been a shift to that I personally believe is a little bit too much and too quickly. We decided to be in what we call a listen and learn mode. So we're commissioning research, we're doing pilots. We don't know. We decided we don't know what to do yet. It is probably true that we will. But what is important about what happened is how unprepared we were as organizations in the social change space, and that I include journalists into that. So it was surprising, it was shocking, it was at a scale that no one had predicted, and everything from then on has been reactive. So the lesson for me would be, what do we need to do for this not to happen again? And we've been thinking about that. We don't know what it is, but we definitely were not prepared.
Does anyone have another quick response on that, or should I go to other questions? Stephanie, and then we'll go to more questions.
Sometimes it can also make sense to become a bit more creative if it really doesn't work the way you try to. So maybe it makes sense to think about, okay, can we build a network or something to attract money, or like attract money from different funders? So that might be also an option, but I would just recommend that if it's really like your core mission too, because otherwise it doesn't make sense, of course. So
That's a great tip. Okay, I will take 2 questions. I think there was one here.
Hi there. My name's Jasmine. Sorry. Stand up. Okay, fine. Hi, my name's Jasmine. I just recently have gone freelance from a big company. And there's been a lot of talk about funding and supporting independent news organizations, which is great. But what about independent freelance roaming journals? So do any of your organizations do that? And what do you expect those journals to bring to the table in terms of ideas, specific topics? Is there a niche is there a trend right now that you're looking for?
That's a great question. Maybe I can take a second one if there is a question. Maybe the gentleman here in the second row, and then, and then we can just bundle them and see who. Go for it.
Okay, hello. I'm the founder of the Italian Constructive News Association, and I have 3 questions for you. The first one is if wider topics such as constructive journalism could be interesting to be founded for each one of your organization. The second question is if Italy is an interesting place to be to be founded, or would you prefer a bilingual project, maybe in Italian and in English? And the third question is what kind of document do you need to value the project? If you prefer a business plan, a wider or a specific project, and if there are any KPI that you consider to found the project. Thank you.
Great questions. Okay, so we have 4 questions there. Does anyone want to field the freelancer one of people who are working directly with freelancers? No? Nishant, do you do any work with freelancers? Stephanie?
As I said, we just support intermediaries. So we also support the Association of Freelance Journalists in Germany. But, well, the question would be, what are you really looking for? Is it like setting up an organization to strengthen freelancers and their position in the journalism field? Or is it more about research grants? Because then maybe you can apply at a call from the Gates Foundation or other foundations. So, I mean, there are a lot of research grants out there. But as I said, we do not do that due to the fact that we are not thematically led. So, yeah.
Miguel, maybe you can...
Yeah, so we, a couple of, well, I can, freelancers, yes, we don't support freelancers directly, but several of our programs support freelancers heavily, including the European Journalism Center that I mentioned, 5 years of support to the Pulitzer Center, etc., etc. And as it happens, in many of the countries where we work, most of the foreign coverage nowadays is done by freelancers. So by establishing new verticals on issues that are far away, normally the people who does the groundwork is freelancers. And there are some editors in the room that can attest to that, yeah.
Open Society Foundations as a whole has a fellowships program, and so, you know, that's a possible avenue. But as the journalism program, unfortunately, we support organizations. We don't support, you know, freelancers or any kind of documentary particular, you know, individual programs. So
why is that? Is it because it's just a lot more overhead because you're dealing with a lot of individuals?
I think it's less about overheads. It's more, you would get many, you know, everyone's got their own little project, and we really believe that rather in the times in which we live, we want strong journalism organizations. And I think it's also, you know, in response, I think Miguel's point around, you know, the disinformation and the rapid response to things, you know, journalism takes time to establish itself, to build trust, to be effective in a particular place. And I think that's why you want to build strong journalism organizations, because in an emergency, they need to be there, they need to be functional already. You can't suddenly, you know, manufacture them. So.
Okay, let's move on. Constructive journalism How does that fit into anyone's portfolio, or solutions journalism? Is that a thing that you actively look towards? Miguel again.
I can go first because we are great believers on constructive and solution journalism. We do support organizations that does it, that think about it, that articulate it. We work with media organizations that believe in the concept at large of constructive journalism, or solutions journalism as they call it in the US, or impact journalism as they call it in France, etc., etc. Yes, heavily. And we do it because we do believe that there is a fair amount of evidence that a solutions approach is one of those content attributes that makes journalism impactful. Fair amount of evidence, and if anyone wants the evidence, there's Constructive Institute out of Denmark, Solution Journalism Network out of the US, and plenty of other researchers that I can point people to.
Thank you. Nishant, Sue, you want to...
There was also the question about what the plan should look like and what the proposal should look like. And I think, we have some sort of template, but most what we're looking for in a proposal is really clear thinking. What are you trying to do? Avoiding all the jargon and the buzzwords and the development, blah, 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 with due respect to development. But it's actually, what are you trying to achieve? How do you plan to do it? How are you thinking about building and going forwards into the future? And so those are the kinds of things that I think that we would look for in a plan. And it usually starts off with, a conversation, a concept note in a page, just laying out the ideas. And from that would be a conversation, and then we would say, send us a proposal which needs to have a lot more meat and substance on the bones. But it really is around clear thinking and how, rather than fancy, flowery ideas.
Nishant, can I throw the Italy question to you? Because I think it's an interesting one. Italy is a very developed economy, but has a lot of problems around media capture, media ownership, and so on. Sometimes I feel like these countries fall between two places, right? Like they're not the major markets of, let's say, the UK or Germany in terms of that, but they also don't fall into a fully captured state that you might sort of address, like Hungary or something as. How do you feel about these countries? And I realize that's a very generalized question.
Yeah. So we've only recently started funding in Western Europe, actually after Brexit, the referendum, Who knows when Brexit will actually happen. And we started funding in the UK and France and Germany. And, we're in an incredibly privileged position, all of us at this table as funders. We steward the resources of those that are trying to create impact in the world. And unfortunately, those resources are limited. And also our staff is limited. We, as Luminate, try and ensure that the staff that are issuing grants and investments are very, very close to the journalists, the activists, and the others that we work with as part of our portfolio. And we have people in about 12 countries, and those people are usually of the countries in which we operate. So in Kiev, we have our staff member is Ukrainian, in Yangon, he's Burmese, and so on. And so the dynamic, and we do that because we want to have the local context. We want to make sure that we're making intelligent decisions in that ecosystem and actually being of help rather than sort of parachuting in. What that means is that going into a new country is an endeavor. And if we do it, we want to make sure we do it well. So, as the gentleman in the audience said, Italy is a really, really interesting country, and it's also one that is in a delicate place at the moment, and we acknowledge that. But I don't think we're in a position with our team and resources at the moment to work on it. And so these trade-offs are very, very hard, and they're humbling and they're difficult because we really acknowledge the incredible work that journalists in this country are doing. That journalists all around the world in the many countries in which we don't work are doing. But unfortunately, we have to make trade-offs in order to be effective where we work.
Thank you. So I'll take a couple of very quick questions from the audience. We have a patient person here, and I'll take 2 questions because I have 3 minutes left.
Good morning, Francesca Totolo, Primato Nazionale. A question to Sue Valentine. Who guarantee that the foundation, like Open Society, do not compromise the impartiality of the journalists that they finance? We know that Open Society has its own political agenda. For example, I was severely attacked to commit to protect journalists. Do you know? Okay. For my investigative journalist about immigration induced in Italy. So for Open Society, should journalists just report NGO press release? Sue?
No. Journalists need to do their work as journalists. They should not be reproducing anybody's press release on its own. I mean, I won't go into the journalism around verification, contextualization. Those are the kind of standards we expect from independent journalism. But maybe we can talk afterwards if there's a particular issue that, because I don't think that the Open Society Foundations has, well, certainly the independent journalism program doesn't have a particular agenda except to promote and support independent journalism. And with those qualities of what we, transparency, verification, contextualization, accuracy, that's what we believe constitutes independent journalism.
We have time for one more question, and the mic
Yes,
is here.
my name is Idris de Bruyne. I'm working for Journalism Fund. That's an intermediary. And to answer a few questions here in the room, we give grants to journalists.
Can you ask a question, Eads? We've got 2 minutes.
Sorry?
Can you ask a
No,
question?
it was to answer the questions. People were asking,
okay,
is it possible to get money for individual journalists? Yes, it's possible through intermediaries like Journalism Fund, who is funded by Open Society Foundation, Augstein Foundation, and so on. So, and also in Asia, even in Hong Kong, we have the money trail. The only thing we ask is that you collaborate with other people in other countries. But we are active in Asia, Africa, and Europe, but you have to collaborate. So go to our website, and there you will see that it's possible for freelance journalists. And it's open. We don't have any agenda except for the money trail. It has to be around money. It has to be something about money.
Perfect, thank you. That's a super useful resource, that website, for sure. I'm afraid I have to wrap. The sessions this year are shorter than they were last year. I tried my best. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and thank you for coming out.